From the so-called polite annexation of Crimea to the creeping invasion of Donbass to what residents describe as a human safari in Kherson, Russia's attempted conquest of Ukraine gets more dramatic and more difficult to piece together.
The occupied territories are in some ways a complete black hole. We don't know exactly what goes on there.
The first thing that becomes obvious to you is that there's a climate of all-pervasive fear. You can't speak your mind.
If you are a teacher and you continue working in your school under occupation, under Russian curriculum, are you a collaborator or not? It's a very kind of gray area.
People who actively support the Ukrainian cause, that is being violently destroyed. You disagree, you die. It's as simple as that.
Welcome to the last part of our mini-series on life in occupied Ukraine. After we explored the Russian transformation of Crimea and the 11-year-long war in Donbass, it's the newly occupied territories' turn, in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. We'll try to understand how entrenched has Russia made itself there and what that means for the prospect for peace. I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, getting past the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Радио Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
We are entering the southeast now, the regions around Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, bordering the Sea of Azov. BBC Monitoring's Russia editor Vitaly Shevchenko comes from there and will be our guide.
Within the southeast, there are variations. Luhansk and Donetsk, coal mining, more industrial. Kherson, more farming, agricultural. The famous Kherson watermelons, that's where they come from. Every year, a massive barge would sail up the Dnipro River to Kiev, bringing the famous, sweet, delicious watermelons. Zaporizhzhia occupies a special place in Ukrainian history because of the Cossacks that are generally seen as one of the sources of Ukrainian statehood, and that's why Russian claims to Zaporizhzhia sound really offensive to Ukrainians. But when it comes to Donbass, it was seen the rough, working class, slightly decaying Rust Belt. You don't mess with Donbass.
Much of the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions were taken by Russia after the full-scale invasion started in 2022, but Moscow doesn't see itself as an occupying power. Francis Carr is watching Russian TV to understand the Kremlin's thinking.
New territories, or sometimes they're referred to as liberated territories, but never imply aggression or invasion. They speak of parts of Ukraine as occupied by the Kiev regime, is the terminology used. In particular, parts of these 4 regions of Ukraine that Russia has claimed as its own, and which it doesn't control in their entirety.
Initially, there were street protests against the Russian troops. But they died down after a few weeks. Vitaly has been trying to keep across what's happening on the ground and report on it remotely, and it's not an easy task.
The first thing that becomes obvious to you is that there's a climate of all-pervasive fear. You can't speak your mind. Secondly, and this is important, the people who are staying there, they're either happy with Russia being there, or they can't leave, or they are never going to speak their mind. When I tried to interview somebody in Mariupol, for example, they said, "Oh, I don't believe you. You're probably a Russian propagandist posing as a journalist, and you're going to provoke me into saying something unguarded, and I'm going to go to jail. I don't want that. Goodbye. You know, I'm happy with the way things are. I'm not going to tell you more. Goodbye." To find somebody who is willing to talk, it's very, very difficult.
The BBC takes many precautions to protect the anonymity of people who speak to us. Here's what residents of occupied areas have told Vitaly.
If you speak Ukrainian, you are the enemy. If you play Ukrainian music and somebody overhears you, well, you can be arrested. There are no media or schools that are in Ukrainian. The bottom line is, if it's Ukrainian, it has to go.
If you're watching Russian state media, you'll get a completely different picture.
The Kremlin has made efforts to tell Russians that peaceful life is returning to these areas that are now in this happy family of Russia after being under the Ukrainian yoke, where Russian speakers rather than Ukrainian speakers were said to be oppressed by the government in Kiev and had their interests trodden upon and didn't have any say in how their lives were run. According to the Kremlin media, people are being looked after, their pensions are said to be higher, they're said to have better healthcare, better schooling, and this is really to give the impression to the rest of Russia that this invasion of Ukraine had this moral justification rather than being a war of aggression.
A similar story is being told by media inside the areas captured by Russia. As we've already seen with other occupied territories, taking control of the media is one of the first things Moscow does.
The media outlets that Russia installed there, they're really keen to stress how free it was, how happy the locals were to go and vote for Vladimir Putin and his party.
В Херсонской области стартовал референдум по вопросу вхождения в состав России.
But because these media operatives, I'd call them, they're often not very professional. Sometimes this facade slips and you can peer behind the scenes, and what you begin to see is chilling.
Безопасность членов избирательных комиссий и избирателей также обеспечена.
You see men with machine guns sort of looking from behind the corner at polling stations, men wearing military uniforms, visiting locals with ballot boxes. Also, the exaggerated happiness of all these voters and people who are supposedly overjoyed to be ruled by Russia again. I'm old enough to remember how it was in the Soviet Union. I've seen it before.
Владимир Сальто исполнил заветные мечты двух детей из Херсонской области.
In terms of the media scene, of course, free media, forget it. Media in Ukrainian, forget it. You're not supposed to speak Ukrainian. One good example of how they do it, there's somebody called Alexander Malkevich, an associate of the late mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. He was dispatched to places like Kherson and Zaporizhzhia region specifically to set up the right kind of media companies that would broadcast the right sort of message. Ukraine, bad. Russia, good. It's a very uniform picture.
The newly occupied territories don't get a uniform treatment. One city stands out in terms of the money the Russians have poured in to rebuild it after almost completely destroying it.
When Russia launched its assault on Mariupol in the very first days of the full-scale invasion, it was brutal. The UN estimates that 90% of buildings were damaged or destroyed. And I'm talking about a city of almost 500,000 people. There was little to no regard for human life whatsoever.
We all remember these Ukrainian soldiers who were holed up in the Azov-style steel plant for weeks, surviving and staving off the wave after wave of Russian attack. And for Putin, it was a matter of pride to win this battle. You could almost compare it to the way that Grozny was treated in Chechnya at the beginning of Putin's reign, when all of this money was funneled into the city and today looks completely unrecognizable. I think for Putin, it's a matter of showing that this is a Russian city forever and will never be given back to Ukraine.
They built a whole district called Nevsky after the Neva River in St. Petersburg, the home city of Vladimir Putin.
In 2023, President Putin even visited Mariupol under the cover of night, and Russian state TV showed him driving around parts of the city.
здоровья.
His journey was verified by media in the West, including the BBC. They were able to identify certain buildings that he drove past.
Putin visited specifically to make that point and show on television these pictures of brightly coloured apartment blocks. What television didn't see are all the other parts of Mariupol that are still lying in ruins.
Why do you think Mariupol is so important for Putin personally?
Russia wants to create a hub to transport military goods from Russia to Crimea, but also good picture. It matters to the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin to a huge extent. They're all about media pictures and what Russians see on television.
Vitaly was saying earlier that many people left those newly occupied areas. We can only guess how many remained. And many newcomers are settling in.
The local Russia-installed authorities, they say that 70,000 people living in Mariupol are members of the Russian military or construction workers who have come from Russia. The point being that, you know what, we can liberate, quote unquote, and we can rebuild.
The main incentive offered to Russians is the preferable mortgage rate.
2% ипотека, очень доступная.
The average mortgage rate in Russia is about 27%. If you move to somewhere in the occupied territories, you can get a mortgage for just 2%. There's reports of Russians from the wealthier cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg moving there because it's warmer and they can live in a new apartment block.
Проходите. Трехкомнатная
квартира. It's somewhere that the Russian state is trying to tell them is safe and is Russia forever. There are jobs going. There's a lot of preference given to soldiers. And this is really all about ripping up the Ukrainian fabric of these places and turning them into Russian cities.
More than 20,000 people are said to have been killed in the battle for Mariupol. And those who left their home city have lost everything they had. The center of Mariupol may have risen from the ashes, but other newly occupied towns are yet to see Russia's constructive side. The city of Kherson, for example, which the Ukrainian army has retaken, witnessed a new and rather chilling phenomenon.
Our listeners may have heard the phrase human safari.
Война с мирным населением приобретает форму буквально сафари на людей.
Residents of Kherson report time and again instances where local buses, ambulances, civilian cars are being targeted by Russian drones for the sole reason of just being there. Russia embarked on a campaign to destroy the city and make life there impossible, to make the city unlivable. I was talking to a prominent Ukrainian comedian, Anton Tymoshenko. He told me about a visit last autumn. He was being driven in a car and the driver rolled down the windows and Anton thought, let's breathe in the fresh air. But the driver said, no, we need to have the windows down so we can hear Russian drones approaching, because that's what happens. You're driving and there's a drone and it hits you, even though it's very obvious that this is a civilian car.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Russia's efforts at Russification of the newly occupied territories follow a familiar pattern. The media is brought into line, and another target area is education.
If I say that schools are different, that would be a huge understatement. Curriculum was in Ukrainian, about Ukraine, and what we have now, language, Russian, textbooks, Russian, ideology, Russian. It's all about how great Russia is.
Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has taken pains to almost re-educate its youth. Vladimir Medinsky, an aide to Putin, has co-authored a new series of history textbooks.
Новая Россия – это гораздо больше того, что мы представляем себе даже сегодня.
Which paint Russia in the light of this proud, victorious nation, which has never been guilty of any kind of historical injustices, but has always been on the right side of history. And these textbooks are also being unrolled in the occupied territories, aimed at molding this younger generation of Ukrainians, making them grow up as Russians, trying to create a break with their Ukrainian past.
how are they making this stuff appealing to the young generation?
We've seen a number of comic books focusing on the Russian invasion of Ukraine coming from the Russian Defense Ministry, and one in particular turned the colonel accused of carrying out war crimes in the town of Bucha by the name of Umorbekov in some kind of hero rather than a war criminal or a villain. You could even compare these comics being produced by Russian sources to Marvel comics in the West.
There's more to youth indoctrination than textbooks. The producer and the presenter of this show once wore the red scarf of our country's young pioneer movement. We thought this was a relic of the past, but the concept of ideological youth organizations is very much alive and well in today's Russia and the territories it holds.
In October 2022, Yunarmia, which is the Russian youth army, opened offices across the 4 annexed regions. And in 2023, offices were set up for this movement called the Movement of the First, aimed at educating young Russians from the age of 6. Also, in the new regions, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of schools across the area which are signed up to this.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Movement of the First was set up by Putin, and he continues to be its main patron and has even discussed giving it the name of Pioneers, which is what the main youth movement in the Soviet Union was called.
The local authorities don't shy away from reminding parents about their duty to send their children to Russian schools or face the consequences. This chilling recording is from Lazurne in the occupied Kherson region.
We have a list of children whose parents didn't send them to school. According to the laws of the Russian Federation, these parents will face civil, then criminal charges. My dears, we would welcome you, even if speaking Ukrainian. Would you respect the laws of the country that has taken you in? This is Russia. We have laws. Your behavior will be punished harshly and mercilessly.
If you've been listening to these series, you'll be familiar with Yana Lushnevskaya from our Kyiv team, who is closely following events in the newly occupied territories.
We've heard of cases where headmasters would be kidnapped, arrested, and pressured into switching to Russian instruction and to the Russian curriculum. And one of the stories that I heard is that it's really hard for parents who want alternative education for their children. It's a very tricky balance because they want their children to hear another side of the story, but they're also cautious about making their children too pro-Ukrainian because they might come into school and say something controversial, and then the child and the parents will get into trouble.
But despite the dangers, there is some pushback. Vitaly found evidence of clandestine efforts to offer some Ukrainian lessons to children in the occupied territories.
I've seen reports suggesting that by day children, they go to Russian schools, but after that formal schooling is over, they attend Ukrainian classes. Huge efforts are being made to conceal their identity because if anybody finds out, well, they're in trouble, their parents are in trouble. But I can't say is how widespread this phenomenon is, but it's extremely dangerous. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian children are believed to have been abducted by Russia. How? Why? Because a lot of them, they've lost their parents because they were killed or imprisoned. That's an example of the price Ukrainian parents can pay by refusing to allow their children to be indoctrinated. You can get killed, you can get jailed, and your children can be taken away and indoctrinated in Russia.
We know the names of tens of thousands of children kidnapped by Russia.
In 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner Maria Lvova-Belova for the alleged abduction of Ukrainian children. You can hear them discuss on Russian TV how she has adopted a boy from Donbass. The Kremlin has been consistently rejecting the ICC's accusation, saying it's been removing children from a war zone for their own safety.
Российская Федерация не признает юрисдикцию уголовного суда.
Maria Lvova-Belova said, those children from Ukraine tried singing the Ukrainian anthem. They chanted glory to Ukraine. They said, and I quote, nasty things about the president, i.e. Vladimir Putin. But it all changed. We worked on them. Now they're happy to be in Russia.
She speaks about saving children from the conflict zone and allowing them to be adopted by ostensibly loving Russian families. But of course, some of these children have their names changed, losing their Ukrainian identity. And even if some of them are orphans, many of them do have relatives in Ukraine or Ukrainian relatives who have now left the country. And they find it almost impossible to establish any links with their children or grandchildren.
Vitaly spoke earlier about underground education, and that's not the only manifestation of Ukrainian resistance against the occupying authorities.
If you disagree, you can be killed. That's why Ukrainian resistance in occupied parts of Ukraine takes, well, forms that are easier to carry out and less easy to catch. So what I keep seeing on social media are people stretching out their hands with a yellow ribbon with a landmark in the background, such as Naval Monument in Sevastopol. They take a picture of their hand and the yellow ribbon, and then it gets posted online. There's also a group of women called Zla Mavka, who are engaged in non-violent forms of protests, such as spraying pro-Ukrainian graffiti or spreading pro-Ukrainian leaflets. They don't even know each other, because if one of them gets captured, she would not be able to reveal who the other members of the group are.
The group spoke to the Ukraina, an independent media project which provided a voiceover to protect their identities.
Mavka is this forest creature from Ukrainian mythology. The movement emerged in Melitopol in early 2023 when it became hardly possible to resist the Russians more openly. They have a little newspaper which they spread via mailboxes. They're leaving them in parks, on benches. It's mostly to show to others, those who may still have pro-Ukrainian views, that they're not alone, that they would not feel as lonely and as isolated and as hopeless.
There are also reports of Ukrainian partisans in places like Melitopol district derailing trains with military equipment. But in terms of physical, practical impact, this resistance has, it's minimal.
How is Ukrainian media treating this resistance? Is it giving it undue prominence?
Of course, Ukrainian secret services, Ukrainian propaganda, they would be interested in creating this impression of a massive resistance movement, very active under Russian occupation. I believe we've seen similar efforts directed at bigging up people from Russia who've joined the Ukrainian army to fight the Russian army.
And what does Russia make of these resistance movements? Does state media acknowledge them?
They are very careful to cover it from the point of the Russian state clamping down on it. And so if you're watching Russian state TV, 24-hour news channel, you will constantly see reports of Federal Security Service arresting so-called saboteurs in occupied Ukraine.
Задержан житель Снежного, осуществлявший поджоги по заданию украинских спецслужб.
And the story that most Russians are getting is that there are these small pockets of resistance and that they don't really have any genuine impact.
So if you happen to find yourself living under Russian occupation, you can either cooperate, take up some mild form of resistance, or try to leave. Making it out involves a procedure called filtration.
According to the testimony of the people who went through it, is just as terrible as it sounds. You have to go through a very thorough security check by Russian security forces. They try to figure out whether you have any connection to the Ukrainian military or if you are a patriotic activist. They would check your phone for pictures and for suspicious contacts. They would tell you to undress potentially to see if you have any patriotic tattoos with Ukrainian national symbols. And they could take you to a detention center. In some cases, families have not heard back from such prisoners again.
Ukraine has listed more than 60,000 people as missing since 2022. All routes out of the occupied territories lead to Russia, if you don't count the front line. Filtration is the start of a long and uncertain journey.
Those who do manage to pass filtration end up in Russia, and then via Belarus and Poland, they would enter Ukraine. And then they would register as IDPs. It's expensive to set up a new life in a new place. The payments from the Ukrainian government are not enough to rent a flat or to provide for your family. And some people do end up leaving Ukraine. Some would go to countries that have generous payments for refugees, but some would, according to some reports, come back to occupied territories even because at least they might still have a home there. And we do get this tragic situation where people need to make a choice whether they're staying in their own country or going back to their home that's currently under occupation just for purely economic reasons.
Russian TV has joyfully picked up on this story.
Тысячи мелитопольцев, которые в начале спецоперации выехали на территории подконтрольной Украине, возвращаются домой.
But how is this kind of movement of people back to the occupied territories going down in Kiev? This is tricky territory for Ukraine.
There was a big scandal reported by the Ukrainian media in November when a pro-presidential MP said in an interview that as many as 150,000 internally displaced Ukrainians had returned to their homes in occupied areas.
Майже 150 тисяч внутрішньо переміщених осіб повернулися на окуповані.
And they did that allegedly due to lack of aid and support from the government. And he was talking about Mariupol, where allegedly 70,000 people returned. And that assessment caused an outcry in Ukraine, and he eventually retracted his comments. But there was a lot of criticism, and obviously Ukrainians don't want to see them returning to occupied area. Then maybe you're not a patriotic Ukrainian, but then on the other side you have economic concerns, which are a huge obstacle for a lot of internally displaced people.
It sounds like residents of newly occupied areas are getting a rough deal wherever they go. If they manage to make it out of the occupied areas, they could be struggling financially, and back home they face oppressive authorities.
It's top-down pressure spearheaded by the occupation authorities and often reliant on local collaborators who create an atmosphere of, look, we're here for good, Russia's here to stay, you better conform. And there would be people who would target dissidents, would report on them, would put pressure on them.
Vitaly has brought up the C word, collaborators. This is a legal area, but it's also an ethical conundrum that has sparked fierce debates in Ukraine and international criticism of Kiev.
The term collaboration has been widely used in Ukraine since 2014, but it was only included in the criminal code in the early days of the full-scale invasion. They concern things like public denial of aggression against Ukraine or public calls to support Russia, or voluntarily taking up posts in the occupying states' administrations. People could go to jail for a long time.
People from occupied territories who've taken up jobs under the Russian administration might find themselves between a rock and a hard place. From the Russian side, they face coercion. From the Ukrainian side, the threat of legal prosecution.
По фактам колабораційної діяльності це 75 кримінальних проваджень.
In 2022, there were 272 guilty verdicts, and in 2023, the number was 793. The problem with this law, as human rights activists say, is that it doesn't take into account the line between being a collaborator and merely trying to survive in occupation. For example, if you are a teacher and you continue working in your school under occupation, under Russian curriculum, are you a collaborator or not? It's a very kind of gray area, and international organizations have been asking the Ukrainian government to revise this legislation to take into account that for a lot of Ukrainians, it's not really a choice, it's about survival, and a lot of those activities don't really harm Ukraine's national security.
So what next for the occupied territories and their people?
The idea that those territories should be allowed to remain occupied by Russia is always rejected.
Україна буде вільною. Будуть звільнені і Херсон, і Нова Каховка, Мелітополь, Бердянськ, Дніпрорудне, і всі.
There are Ukrainian people living there. It would mean abandoning them. Thousands of Ukrainian troops died trying to liberate those regions. Was their sacrifice in vain? Without major security guarantees, leaving those regions under occupation would not really solve anything. That's one of the big narratives, is that, as we saw after 2014, Russia's appetite kind of only grew after it was basically allowed to have Crimea.
Russia is sparing no effort to entrench itself in occupied parts of Ukraine. Before the Ukrainian forces retook Kherson, a lot of the billboards said, Russia is here for good. You better assimilate, take Russian passports, send your children to camps in Russia. And that is Russia's policy to future-proof itself.
It's clear that the Kremlin is making a concerted effort to erase all trace of Ukrainian society and culture from the occupied territories and replace it with all the trappings of Putin's Russia. And on the battlefield, Russia has now got the upper hand. So if the conflict continues deep into 2025, with the current level of international support for Kiev or less, one can only assume that Russia will occupy even more territory and cement its influence there. And yet, despite Putin's belief that Ukraine is not a real country, over centuries of rule by Russia and other colonial powers, Ukrainians have nevertheless managed to keep the flame of their national identity burning bright.
Thank you to our experts Yana Lushnevskaya, Vitaly Shevchenko and Francis Carr. And thanks for listening from the Global Jigsaw podcast team, Krista Shaturi and me, Krassi Twig. This program was mixed by Nick Scripps. Till next time.